Jerusalem is an ancient city with thousands of years of history, 4,000 years of history, and there's been many layers of civilizations here. The holy city of Jerusalem, the center for the three monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Jerusalem, why is it here? Why is it so holy? It shouldn't even be here. It was destroyed completely twice. It was attacked 50 times and recaptured 44 times. And each time someone leaves its mark. This city is not on any ancient trade route. It's on an earthquake fault. There's no water in the city except for one little spring. There's no reason for it to be here. It's surrounded by higher mountains. You look around and it's this holy basin, they call it. This is a map of the old city of Jerusalem. By the way, the old city of Jerusalem was all there was up until 1860. If you only had the people living inside the walls of the city. Now the old city is divided into four quarters. We have like an X right here and like this. We have the Armenian quarter, the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, and the Jewish quarter. And then at the end we have the Temple Mount, the noble sanctuary. And we're going to walk along these roads inside the old city and we're going to see how it looks from the inside. We have to go back in history a little bit. Everybody remembers Abraham, the first Jew, and he was from Iraq. God said to Abraham, Lech lecha, go forth to a country, a land I will give you. He comes to the Holy Land, to Canaan, and he lives in Nablus, Shechem, and he moves down to Hebron and Beersheba. And one day, you know the story, the angels come to Abraham and they say to him, take your son, your only son, Isaac, and bring him to where we will show you. And he leaves his wife Sarah behind. He takes his servants, he comes over to here, and on the nearby mountain he looks out and he sees this hill here. Right now it's this golden dome with a rock. Then it was nothing here. And he leaves his servants, takes his son Isaac, goes up there and he builds an altar. And his son Isaac says, I see the altar, but where's the sacrifice? Abraham grabs his son Isaac, he says, you're the sacrifice. He binds him to the altar, and to prove his devotion to God, he was supposed to kill him, but the angels come down, we know the story, and they say, no, you have proven your devotion to God. There will be no more child sacrifices. So we fast forward in history, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. 12 sons, there was a famine. They left, they went to Egypt, and the 12 tribes of Israel went to Egypt. After a few hundred years, they became enslaved until Moses comes along. And Moses and God free the Israelites. They wander in the desert for 40 years. They get the Torah, the 10 Commandments in the Sinai, and they come around to the Moab Mountains, and the 12 tribes of Israel are going to come back to the land of Canaan. Moses isn't allowed to come with them, but Joshua leads them into the land of Canaan. They come over, and if you read in the Bible, it says how they conquer the land, and Joshua divides the land up among the 12 tribes. What he says there is that the border of Judea and Benjamin passes right around Jerusalem. Jerusalem doesn't belong to any tribe, okay? If you go forward a few hundred years, we have the first kingdom of the Israelites, King Saul and David, who was a warrior. He fought Goliath, and he becomes the king when King Saul dies. And David wants to unite the 12 tribes. What does he do? He comes to this little city, this little Jebusite city here, and he conquers it. And when he conquers the city, he says, you know, Jerusalem doesn't belong to any tribe. It's kind of like the Washington, D.C., doesn't belong to any state. So he says, I'm going to make Jerusalem my capital. And he makes it his capital. And he's going to build a temple to God. But God says, I love you, David, but you've been a bad boy, an adulterer, lots of blood on his hands. You won't build the temple, but your descendants will. And David dies in the city of David, and he's buried there. And later, his son, Solomon, builds the first temple. And that's why we consider this Jerusalem to be so sacred for us. If you look forward into history, the Babylonians come by and they destroy that temple in the 6th century BC. They took all the Jews off to exile in Babylonia, and by the waters of Babylon we wept. But they disappeared from history, and the Assyrians took over. And King Cyrus says to the Jews, go back to your land and rebuild your temple. So they did. And they built a temple, a second temple. And to be honest, it was a kind of a rinky-dink temple. Even the old-timers who knew the first temple saw the new second temple, and they wept because they were so upset. Over the history, another Jew comes along, a very fascinating character called King Herod. Herod was a sort of a mongrel. His father was an Edomite, his mother was a Nabatean princess. Grandfather was forcibly converted into Judaism, so the Jews didn't always trust him, was he a real Jew or not. He was Roman by citizenship, Jewish by faith, Hellenistic by culture, and he married a princess of the Hashmonean dynasty, and he got himself into the royal family. And with Roman backing, he eventually became the king. King Herod, the mighty King Herod, the magnificent King Herod, the King Herod the builder, King Herod the paranoid person, the psychotic person, lots of titles. He was a very interesting character. And one of the things he did was he took that second temple and he renovated it. And he pretty much built a third temple, but we call it the second temple. And what he did was he took the whole platform of the Temple Mount and he built a retaining wall. And on there it was a massive mount, and he built the second temple, which was the largest edifice at that time in the world. And he died, and eventually the Romans were here as governors, and there was a revolt. Now, around 66 AD, the Jews had enough of the Roman rule and they revolted against them. But there was more to it than that. The Jewish people themselves were divided. There was a schism. There was a growing gap between the rich and the poor, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And it sort of created this sort of unwillingness to even unite together to fight the Romans, and they fought among themselves. And that pretty much led to the fall of the Jewish Empire of Judea. And in the year 70 AD, the Romans came to Jerusalem, and after a long siege, they destroyed the temple. And General Titus had his soldiers go up into the Temple Mount and topple over these retaining walls. And we can see these walls, which have laid here since the year 70 AD. You can almost feel them hitting. They're just sort of a testament to the destruction. After the Romans destroyed the Temple Mount, and you can see the rubble here, 700 years later, the Arabs took over, and the Abbasid dynasty comes here. They collect some of these stones, and they build a separate palace. And what we see behind us is stones that were made by the Jewish King Herod for the Second Temple retaining wall, being used in secondary use for the palaces of the Arab conquestors. So behind me is the Western Wall. Over here we have the continuation of the Western Wall, where Jewish people worship, and it's considered the most holiest site for Judaism, not because it was the temple. The Second Temple was on the top of the mountain. This was a retaining wall, but it's all that's left from that Second Temple period. And you can see that these Herodian stones were carved with their very specific borders. This was a retaining wall built by King Herod. After King Herod died, his sons and grandsons ruled here as King Agrippa II, and eventually they revolted against the Roman rule, who were the overall governors of the area. So in the 2nd century, there was another revolt against the Romans, and the Roman Emperor Hadrian crushed it, and he exiled the Jews forever, and he renamed the city, and he renamed the country from Judea to Palestina, and the name of the city of Jerusalem he changed to Alia Capitolina. And he built a massive new city, and we're standing on top of what's the Cardo, the main heart road. So we're in front of the Tower of David, this beautiful, magnificent tower. It goes back 2,000 years ago. You see the stones from the Herodian era, because King Herod built a palace here. And this became afterwards the fortress of Jerusalem, where the kings of the Crusaders lived here, the Mamluk rulers lived here. And you can see it's surrounded by a moat, because they want to protect themselves from the people. And you know, this tower, this wall, is one of the few things that were left that the Romans did not destroy. And the reason that General Titus didn't destroy it was, when he went back to Rome, he wanted to tell the emperor, who was his father, I had to leave a little bit of a remnant to show that those Jews were really a tough people to fight against. And this is the kind of formidable towers we had to destroy. In ancient times, in the time of the Second Temple, Jews were obligated to come to Jerusalem to pray at the Second Temple. And so Jews would come from all over Judea, Galilee. One of the people who came here was Jesus. And the Jews would, before they would go to the temple, they would have to purify themselves. And down below this valley is one of the few springs in Jerusalem, the Shiloach. And the pilgrims would cleanse themselves, walk up a staircase in a state of grace, and walk up these steps into the Hulda gate and walk into the Temple Mount. Before that, they had to get a half a shekel payment to the temple. And so you would trade your bronze coins for that half a shekel. And over here was the street of the money changers. And if we read in the New Testament, Jesus was very upset that they were turning his house of worship into a den of thieves, and he flipped the money changers table right here. Now, this is one of the few places where archaeologists can say that Jesus had walked. And I'll tell you a funny story. A tour guide told me this. In the early 70s, there was a fella called Neil Armstrong, the first human to walk on the moon. And he came here, and he was kind of a devout fella. And the tour guide told him, this is where the steps right along here where Jesus walked. And Neil Armstrong said, you know, I walked on the moon, but the small step I take here excites me more than that step on the moon. Now, on top of the mount here, where the second temple and the first temple once stood, today stands the magnificent building of the Dome of the Rock. It's beautiful, built in the early 700s, and it's 80% original because it sits on the bedrock, the same bedrock where maybe Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac and where Muslims believe Muhammad ascended to heaven. Now, further to the south, there's another magnificent building called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And everybody can see it with its big black mosque, big dome up there. That was the first mosque. Now, you know, the Dome of the Rock is not a mosque. It's a monument to Muhammad. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque is a mosque where you pray. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre here in the old city of Jerusalem. This is the holiest site for Christians. It's here they believe that Jesus was crucified, was buried, and resurrected. Now, when the Roman Empire 300 years later became Christian and became the Byzantine Empire, they came here and they erected a church. It was a beautiful, magnificent church, but was destroyed by the Arab conquest in the 7th century. Later, 1,000 years ago, when the Crusaders came and reconquered Jerusalem, they built another church. And that's what we see here. It's a Crusader Gothic era church from 1,000 years ago. Now, when they were defeated, the Muslims took over the church, but they didn't destroy it, but they took over the controls of the door. And they gave the key to a Muslim family. And to this day, that Muslim family comes every day and shuts the door to the church. Now, inside, we have lots of Christian sects, Christian faiths. We have the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, the Catholics, the Coptics, the Ethiopians. And inside, each one jealously guards their area of the church. Now, they had a lot of infighting going on over the centuries. And about 150 years ago, they went to the Sultan in Istanbul and said, listen, we need to have some kind of order. And so the Sultan says, you know what? Status quo. Whatever you control at this moment, in the 1850s, that's what you control. And you know, look at the top ledge here. We have a little ladder. That symbolizes that status quo and that cooperation, because 150 years ago, after the church doors were shut, one of the monks perhaps would go on the ledge. Maybe he was a Greek Orthodox monk. He would lower a basket to get some food and wine, a loaf of bread, and would pull it back up for the night. But the ledge belonged to a different sect, the Armenians, and they were fighting over who was controlling what. So today they left that ladder, which has been there for 150 years, to show that they are able to get along. So now we're standing in front of the old walled city. This is a beautiful walled city that was built in the 16th century by the Ottoman Empire. It's one of many walls that were built in Jerusalem. This one is actually recognized as a World UNESCO Heritage Site. And we're standing in front of the Jaffa Gate, which is right here, one of 7 beautiful gates in the old city. It's called the Jaffa Gate because if you leave this gate and you go down this road, you end up in Jaffa. And in Jaffa, they had an old city with the Jerusalem gate, and that would come to Jerusalem. But you know, it has another name. It's called the Bab el-Khalil, which means the gate to Hebron, because if you leave this gate and go in that direction, you go to Hebron. So every one of the gates has a name associated with the gate, like the Damascus gate. And you know, this gate was a scene where the Kaiser Wilhelm back in 1903 came to the Ottoman Empire and he told the Turks, I want to come into the city to dedicate a church, but I don't want to get off of my horse. I want to ride my horse into the city, take down the walls. So the Ottoman Empire took down the walls, they filled in the moat, and Kaiser Wilhelm, the ruler of Prussia, rides into the old city. Not 15 years later, the First World War, Jerusalem is in a battle with the British against the Turks and the Germans, and General Allenby conquers the city. He comes to the Jaffa Gate, and he doesn't ride in on his horse because he has reverence for the city. He gets off of his horse and he walks through the Jaffa Gate to the Tower of David, where he accepts the surrender of the city. The Jaffa Gate in modern times is also the scene where the Jerusalem Marathon runs through. The Jerusalem Marathon will come down Jaffa Road, up this ramp, and the runners will run through the gate into the old city, and it's an amazing experience to see the people running and the crowds cheering them on. So we're now in the middle of the Jewish quarter here. Now the Jewish quarter was conquered by the Jordanian army in 1948, and they destroyed everything. So in 1967, after Israel recaptured the old city, it said, let's rebuild the Jewish quarter. But the archaeologists said, wait a second, we have an opportunity of a lifetime. Let's excavate this old city and find out what's underneath. And then we can rebuild on top of it. So they did. And they knew, they had the map of the Roman city of Aelia Capitolina, and they knew that they would find this old Roman road here with the marketplace. Jerusalem is central for the Jewish people. The Second Temple represented the covenant between God and Abraham, God and the Jewish people. And when it was destroyed and Jews were sent into exile, we always dreamed about coming back to Jerusalem. And in the 20th century, Zionism brought us back to this part of the world. And we created again a Jewish state, Israel. But Jerusalem and the Western Wall was left out. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, the paratroopers came and they recaptured the old city of Jerusalem, including the Western Wall, the Temple Mount. Not long ago, I was talking to one of the captains of the paratroopers, and he told me that they felt that they weren't fighting the Jordanian soldiers, but the Roman soldiers, that they came back and they redeemed the city. So for us, the Western Wall has always been a very special place. For the paratroopers, an even extra special place. In fact, every year, the paratroopers, the new recruits, are sworn into the Israeli army right here. With thousands of years of history, Jerusalem is also a very modern city. It's the capital of Israel. It's the largest city in Israel, with over 850,000 people living here. 500,000 of them are Jews, and 300,000 of them are Muslims, another 15,000 or so Christians. And you know what? We're all just trying to love this place.